Hey everybody, thank you for joining us. I'm apologize for little inconvention with the Zoom link. This is why I can host and do the host at the same time. So thank you, Angel, for joining me. I will start with a little bit presenting about myself, about Lola, and you will present yourself. And before we will start with your lecture about feminism, I would like to try to reflect about the reasons why there are so many interpretations about the word feminism and why there are so many misconceptions. So, first thing, I would like to present our host organization, LOLA, Ladies of Liberty Alliance, is a network of independent women who dedicated to spreading the ideas of liberty and free society, individual liberty, free economy, and so on. So LOLA's mission is to educate and to empower women within the liberty women, movement. We understand there are shortage of women within the liberty movement, and our way to make this community grow is actually empowering women to be strong voices for liberty. I'm Anna. I am president of LOLA Israel, and Israel has two chapters. Is like LOLA TLV and the region, and LOLA Jerusalem and the region. So today I want to talk about feminism, but first of all, please tell us about yourself, and then we move into reflection.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. My name is Angel Walker-Werth. My full-time job is with Objective Standard Institute. There, I'm a fellow and a programs manager. So on the fellow side, I help run all kinds of educational events and speak at things like this with our partners. On the program side, we have internships, courses, conferences, et cetera, and I help to plan and run all of that, as well as producing some of my own content, which hopefully you may
כאילו
have seen
בתכלס היא
online.
שואלת אותי האם משהו באמת בתפיסת החיים שלי השתנה בעקבות התוכנית.
Okay. That's all right. I mostly have been involved with LOLA as a speaker, but I'm also working on starting to grow with a couple of co-leaders, a chapter here where I live now in England. So
Thank you. I would like to reflect the reason I wanted to do webinar about feminism. It started from conversation in our community. Someone say, I'm not going to name drop it, but you are here, you know what I'm talking about. I don't feel connected to modern feminism. And I was thinking, okay, what does it mean? I mean, modern feminism is actually means a lot of things. When you say third wave of feminism, we have so many streams, and you have Marxist streams, you have liberal, you have so many types. Um, I consider myself as a feminist, but I'm not sure I'm aware of all the streams. And despite of the fact I was studying gender studies in university, it was mandatory because and somehow I managed to run away from the most horrible course I ever had in university, and I have 2 degrees. That was horrible. I couldn't bear it. I didn't want to even talk about it. So when I consider myself a feminist, it's a non-issue for me. It's like being a vegan. I don't shout on people that I'm, no, maybe some people do that, but it's not an issue. It's part of being libertarian, like a freedom fighter. So you want to be free from expectation. You want to be free as man, equality of freedom. So uh, I asked it, I just want to do some small disclaimer about Lola. Lola is not a feminist organization, but a lot of people think it's feminist. Why? Because we are women. And if you remember a few months ago, we had a panel with you and other ladies about objectivism, about Ayn Rand's legacy. So when I published about this event in objectivist groups around the world, they said, but Ayn Rand was against feminism. And I'm saying, okay, but this webinar is not about feminism. Why do you assume it's about feminism? Because you are only women. Yeah, so people assume when they see us in Israel that we are necessarily feminists. But the fact is that all members are, each member calls himself different way. I mean, it's not a feminist, but it's not feminist. And one of the reasons is that everyone defines feminism in different ways. And there are so many ways. And some of them are so bizarre. I mean, that's crazy. I tried to collect some examples. I mean, I'm sure you did as well. But even though some women understand that they're okay with feminism and there are different interpretations, they don't want to be associated to something so negative. And I think there are some streams that might be vocal compared to others. So I conducted a poll in the largest feminism group in Israel. It's called the Feminist School. There are about 100 people participating, and the vote goes this way. I'm starting from small numbers. 6% voted that feminism is the elimination of the entire male gender. But I will tell you that only men and one woman voted. 7% voted that feminism is about achieving female superiority over men as a compensation for patriarchy. 7% voted for full outcome equality, socially. 12% voted complete equality of choice or freedom for men and women. That's what I voted. And 68% voted for complete equality of opportunity. That's the majority. And yeah, I think that's my reflection. So do you have any reflection before you start? Which misconception did you hear?
Anna, you've set me up so perfectly. There are so many, there's so much of what you've set up there that I want to talk about a little bit more in depth. And I'll just say, I guess, before I dive in sort of more formally, if that's all right, in trying to formulate a definition of feminism, because I definitely have come to these kinds of conversations over the past, like, before I started doing a deep dive on feminism and feminist history like 6 months ago or something. Before that, I definitely would not have like been comfortable defining feminism. But with the research I've done since then, I really like to focus on what are the issues and what are people advocating, while noticing like there are a lot of different schools of thought and trying to look at kind of where they come from. And so some of the things, female superiority, the elimination of the male race, those will come up. And I'm going to try to help trace them to the roots, and also in doing that, explain the comment about Ayn Rand not being fond of feminism. So I think there are historical reasons for a lot of the things that have come up, and I just want to emphasize that I want to talk about it with an emphasis on the issues, but I also had I had also planned to talk at the end about the issue of should you call yourself a feminist? Obviously, I'm not going to tell anyone what to do, but some questions and reflections that might be helpful in answering that question.
Great. So let's start.
Okay. If I can just share my screen quick. Yeah, Google Chrome. Sorry, I've got WhatsApp up. My bad. I'm so sorry. It's not moved for me. There we go. All right. Can you see it, Anna?
Yeah.
Okay, so Anna's already basically done my introduction for me. There are a lot of people today, I think, who don't want to associate themselves with feminism, or who think that modern feminism has gone off the rails and has gone crazy in comparison to historical feminism, which was more delimited and more sensible in their minds. And so I want to talk about what really is the essence of feminism. What are the issues that modern feminists are talking about today? I want to deal with some of the biggest misconceptions around feminism. I want to talk briefly about libertarian feminism, since this is a libertarian group, and then end with the question of, should you call yourself a feminist? As I mentioned, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but just to give you some thoughts and questions to think about. The big questions I want to answer before we get to that last question is feminism man-hating? So dealing with some of those responses you got in your poll there, Anna. Is it unnecessary? This is also something I hear a lot today, that, well, feminism just wanted equality before the law for men and women. We have that, so we don't need it anymore. So is that true? And what are some of the statistics and things to look at in regards to that? What does it look like today, and what are some of the historical roots of the different sides of it that we see? And then what is libertarian feminism? What does that look like? First, though, we need a preliminary definition. If you look up the definition on Google, you get the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. And this is kind of bland and basic, and I felt like describes a little bit more of historical feminism, more so than what we see as modern feminism or even feminism over the 20th century, because that really is focusing on the legal side. Women's rights is, the legal and political side on the basis of the equality of the sexes. But there are not very many people today who really seriously deny that men and women have equal potentials physically it's different, but in terms of moral and intellectual capacity, most people recognize that there are differences between individuals, but women have the potential to be as smart as men, to be as moral as men, or even more so. So that just didn't seem to fully capture it to me. So my definition is the advocacy of equal rights for men and women, and improving treatment of women, because I think that captures more of the social and cultural issues that we'll talk about as we go through. That being said, my definition, I think, is not something that everyone would resonate with. There's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of people who would disagree with that. And some of the feminists we're going to get to, or people who call themselves feminists or whom others call feminists, I would argue their arguments really are not coherent for feminism. If you are arguing for getting rid of the entire male sex, then you have no legs to stand on morally in terms of actual equality, just legal equality. If you think that men don't have rights, then you can't really coherently argue for women's rights. It doesn't make sense. So the version of feminism I argue for is very coherent, and you'll see I'll try to point out where I think that some versions of feminism aren't coherent, and also try to point out where possible, if I'm calling someone a feminist or a group or ideology feminist, but it's because they call themselves that. And sometimes you'll see on my slides scare quotes, and that's usually what I mean, is they call themselves a feminist. I think there's some contradictions in there, but just for the sake of clarity. And we've already touched on this a little bit, but just to back up what Anna and I have been saying with studies, there are a lot of women who don't call themselves feminist today, young women especially, who don't call themselves feminist today. A study from 2019 it was done in Germany and the UK, and Dr. Christina Scharf, who did the research, found that feminism was associated with man-hating, with lesbianism, and lack of femininity. So people don't want to be associated with those things, I guess, unless you're a lesbian. And so they would separate themselves from feminism because they didn't want to be seen as a lesbian or not feminine or whatever. It's kind of an interesting thing, given that lesbians, as we'll talk about, really weren't welcome in the feminist movement until relatively recently. But I think where it comes from is because in the 60s and the 70s, there were a lot of women who eschewed makeup and dressing nicely as being being complicit in the patriarchy. So this idea of, if you don't dress like, very femininely and wear makeup and that sort of thing, then you're butch, you're a lesbian. And so that's I think that's where that association comes from, which, as we'll see later, I think that's even that perception is starting to change. But I think it's still there enough that this is one of the reasons that people don't want to be associated with the term. Even though if you look at polls in most of Western Europe and the US, belief in gender equality has increased, whatever measure you use, or if you just ask people if they think that the genders are equal, which is kind of a vague question, but anyway. That being said, there are some very vocal, very prominent misandrists who call themselves feminists or who are called feminists. And I do think you have to know who these people are and understand what their influence is in order to understand the vision of feminism as man-hating or feminists, self-identified feminists who genuinely do hate men. Probably the most important is Angelica Walker-Werth. I've called her a misandrist feminist because I do think there is a strong difference between misandry and feminism. I don't really think that they go together at all. And misandry is the word, we already have a concept for hating men. It's misandry. Let's just call it that, and we can call feminism what it is. Angelica Walker-Werth was a very influential feminist in the second half of the 20th century. She was also very, very, very outspoken against pornography and very outspoken against men. She had no problems whatever using the state to enforce her views. As I mentioned, she's very anti-porn, and she was very happy for the state to ban porn and to get involved with that because she saw it as necessarily degrading to women, not just when it was done without people's consent, and not just when there was force involved, but all of the time. So that's probably the position she's most known for, but she was involved in a lot of other feminist discussions and issues of the time. She wrote 9 books and myriad articles. She testified in Congress. Others either drew on her work or responded to her work. So you basically can't get into a conversation about modern feminism, particularly in the West, without knowing Dworkin. But she was, as I say, very much a misandrist. Speaking to men, she said, "Have you ever wondered why we are not just in armed combat against you? It is because we believe in your humanity, despite all the evidence." So unfortunately, pretty influential, particularly in the US, but nevertheless. The next one I include for 2 reasons. Her name is Valerie Solanas. I've included her because she comes up if you Google man-hating feminists, and I've included her because some feminists at the time, including relatively moderate organizations like the National Organization for Women, called her a hero. However, a lot of people don't really accept her as part of feminism, and I will explain why. In 1967, she published her book, The Scum Manifesto. And in that book, she argued that women should overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, institute complete automation, and destroy the male sex. There's that idea again. However, also in the 60s, late 60s, I think it was, she shot the artist Andy Warhol. And in the trial and everything that resulted from that, it was found that she was a paranoid schizophrenic.
That was all. She shot Andy Warhol.
Yeah, she
Oh my
shot Andy
God.
Warhol.
Okay, did you know that?
Yeah,
Okay.
so he survived, but she shot him. And so this is why she's very controversial, and a lot of people write her off as crazy. And her book didn't exactly sell very well. But some women, some feminists and feminist organizations called her a heroine, and it was a big discussion in like the late 60s, early 70s. So that's why I've included her, but I completely understand if you're like, no, this lady's crazy, she doesn't count.
Wow.
Those 2 examples might make it sound like that's a 60s, 70s thing. But there's still, I think, an element or aspect of self-identified feminism today that is still misandrist. And to give you an example, Julie Bindel is a self-identified feminist in the UK. She wrote a couple of years ago that hating men is absolutely the right of women. In fact, it is our prerogative. We would be fools not to hate the people who rape, murder, assault, humiliate, abuse, and bully us. In case it is not clear, where I disagree with Bindel is that she's collectivizing. She's looking at all men as a group and not just the individual men who are, rapists or abusers or murderers or whatever. It's perfectly rational to hate the people who are murderers or rapists or whatever. But when you collectivize an entire group like that, you have completely ignored the choice of each individual. You've ignored the part of what they've done that actually makes it immoral, and you condemn everyone based off of that. So to the extent that this is, you'll hear the phrase online sometimes like female rage or feminist rage, I think this is how it's mostly justified today. There's also a bit of radical feminism, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I think this is where a lot of it comes from. And it's not just individual misandrists. I think misandry is common I think it's starting to abate now, but it was fairly common in the media, in various movies and TV shows and things like that. And the most common form it comes in is just throughout the course of a whole TV show or a whole movie, every guy in it sucks. And not just like he's incompetent, but he's an abuser, he's a murderer, he's an asshole, sorry. he's just awful. An example of this would be the Netflix series Made. Mary Wakefield, a journalist in the UK, wrote that the distinctive thing about it is that every male character is an absolute horror. And the interesting thing she found was not just, let me be clear, when I'm talking about TV shows and films, of course, you can say having an individual character who is an abuser or rapist, whatever, is completely valid in the context of a story. You need a villain, that person can be a villain, totally valid. But when you make every man anything from a jerk to a murderer, what you're saying is that all men are this way, that this is fundamentally how men are. And this is unfortunately the vision that some TV shows and movies and things recently are portraying. The interesting thing that Wakefield found was that when she was talking to people about it, she said that most people I've spoken to needed no persuading that men were being given short shrift on screen, but the consensus was that this wasn't unfair, it was simply payback. So there's a bit of vengeance in there as well, in this particular form of misandry, according to some people, or how they perceive it. In terms of the philosophic basis for this, I think some of it is the collectivism that Bindel displayed and that others had. We also need to talk about radical feminism as a branch of feminism. I think it is very opposite in a lot of ways to historical feminism, but this came up in the 1960s. This was mainly what Rand was responding to when she really pushed against feminism and the feminist movement of her time, because most of it was radical feminism. Historical feminism was more individualist, I would argue, in nature. It goes back to the Enlightenment, when the arguments were basically, we all recognize the importance of reason, and what people were trying to argue was that women also are able to use reason, and that if they have education that they were previously denied, then they could work in certain jobs outside the home, they could participate in politics, and so on and so forth. And this in the 19th century started to meld really well with abolitionist arguments that each individual owns him or herself, and that shouldn't just apply to slaves, it should also apply to women. Everyone should be able to live their lives as they choose, as long as they don't get in the way of other people doing the same thing. So these were the arguments we see in historical feminism, and they were extended a little bit and sort of separated out, but these were the basic arguments we saw a lot. And then in the 1960s, something changed. We had a different form of feminism start to come to the fore, and it's usually called radical feminism. And often when people are talking about radical feminism, the key thing about it is that they think that we live in a patriarchal system. This is usually enmeshed with capitalism. They think that capitalism is patriarchal, and that anything that even seems like an improvement actually isn't, because it's supporting the entrenched system. So if we're talking about pay, for example, women or certain groups, whatever you want to talk about, getting a pay increase seems like a good thing, but actually it's not, because it's just helping people to like the current system better, to be more comfortable, more complacent in the system that there is. And really what we need is to overthrow everything. One really interesting philosophic argument and article at the root of radical feminism was written by this lady here, T. Grace Atkinson. And she wrote an article, it was published in 1969. You can find it online. It's 8 pages long, called Radical Feminism. And she sets out a very interesting philosophic argument that I think has really been the fuel of radical feminism and has crept into wokeism and critical race theory and gender ideology as we see it today. In this article, she argued that everyone, because we all have a rational faculty, everyone can see things that he or she cannot achieve. Everyone can imagine a potential. But because you can never fully actualize your potential, I could imagine that I could be the queen of the entire world, right? But I could never actually be that. And because there's always that gap between what we imagine and what we actually are, some people then feel the need to subjugate others in order to make up for that perceived gap. Now, she called this metaphysical cannibalism. And she argued that historically, the group that has engaged in metaphysical cannibalism is men, and they have subjugated women in order to make up for that sort of gap. She described it as the need men have for the role of oppressor is the source and foundation of all human oppression. Now, of course, there is actually a psychological phenomenon where people are not satisfied with themselves, and so as a form of pseudo self-esteem, they bully or manipulate or seek power over others. But this is a psychological phenomenon that could happen to that anyone of any gender could choose and indeed do to some extent. There's no reason it has to be men. There's no reason that you have to collectivize in the way that Atkinson does, and there's no way that you have, or there's Atkinson's argument really just completely ignores free will and people's individual choices. In response to arguments of the day that, well, you can say that men are always subjugating women, but what about romantic relationships or other positive relationships like father-daughter relationships that are perfectly healthy between men and women? Well, she argued that men don't actually have protective feelings towards women. They have protective feelings towards women's functions, looking at them more as property, not looking at them as other human beings. And overall, she concluded that men behave in a mentally deranged manner towards women. In terms of romantic relationships, she says that love is essentially an illusion, and that actually romantic relationships are basically like a Stockholm syndrome where women just get used to being in the subordinate position. It will not surprise you at all to know that Atkinson is a Marxist. And she was really influential in forming radical feminism, which, as I say, has crept into critical race theory and other ideas that we still see today, even though not that many people, I think, know her name. But those are honestly the outliers. If we look statistically at the data for self-identified feminists today, the majority of them don't hate men. If you look at the graph I've got there, this is from a 2023 meta-analysis. They looked at a whole bunch of different studies. The blue is self-identified feminists, the yellow is self-identified non-feminists, and they asked them what their overall view towards men was. And you'll see that on average, the feminists actually had a higher view of men than did the non-feminists. Now, obviously, that's painting with broad brushstrokes, but overall, it paints a pretty interesting picture. Also, there are some prominent feminists who are very much not hating men and actually actively working against the demonization of men or looking at men as all bad, inherently bad. A couple of examples: Bell Hooks was a pretty influential feminist in the US who died recently, and she lamented that our theoretical work critiquing the demonization of men as the enemy did not change the perspective of women who were anti-male, basically saying, unfortunately, we tried, but it wasn't enough to change their minds. Wendy McElroy, who we'll talk about more later because she's an individualist feminist in the libertarian tradition. She's Canadian, she's still alive, but she argues against considering all men as irreformable or rapists, again, pointing out that that is collectivizing all men and not acknowledging their free will. So much for man hating. Now I want to move on to the argument that really we don't need feminism in the West anymore. Maybe they still need it in some theocracies like in Iran, but here in the West we don't need it because we have achieved we've achieved equal rights, basically. And to be fair, we have won a lot of victories in terms of equal rights in the West. Political participation, the ability to vote, the ability to run for office. Everywhere in the West and in many other countries, we have these abilities. The ability to divorce on the same terms as men, the ability to hold the same kinds of jobs outside of the home. Where there are legal restrictions on dress, in many places it's just like don't be indecent, but where there are other restrictions on dress, they apply equally to men and women. Again, this is in the West. There are obviously theocracies, think about Iran, Afghanistan, this does not apply. Owning property and being able to have a bank account and a credit card. In the case of married women, being able to do that without your husband's permission. These are all things that women are able to do pretty much across the board in the West and many other countries as well. So these are huge advances. I think one other place that we can see women have really advanced from the early, beginnings of feminism to now is in education. Not only are women able to access the same levels and types of education as men, but they have in massive numbers. And we actually see it now. It's very common that women are either half of the population in a given university or half of the holders of degrees in a workplace or a country, but sometimes even it's a little bit more than half. Sometimes women are the majority in a university or in those who have higher education degrees. I wasn't always able to find statistics for Israel when I was researching this presentation, but in this case, I was. In 2018, women held 60% of the bachelor's and master's degrees in Israel and 50% of the doctorates in Israel. So there again, you have either half or a little bit more than half of those who are receiving higher education is women. But there are still issues that modern feminists talk about, and I want to go through those now. I'm going to go through 9 of the ones that I see the most and sort of talk about what are the statistics, what's my view on it, and keeping in mind that just because something is an issue doesn't mean that we need the state to fix it. We can be libertarian about many of these issues. Just want to give a quick heads up. The first couple issues are pretty heavy. It's rape and domestic violence and that sort of thing. So just a fair warning. Also, promise it's only 2 of them. It gets a little lighter after that. So the first feminist issue that people are still talking about is rape and rape culture. Rape, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. Rape culture is defined as a culture where sexual violence and abuse is normalized and played down. And because it's a culture, it's a description of the way that people act, the only way you can really prove that it's happening or that it's not happening is how people are actually behaving, what they're actually saying. So to describe that for a whole culture, I think is very difficult. But you can look at things like victim blaming. You can look at things like people saying, she was asking for it. You can look at, what the graphic there is supposed to represent, where there's a double standard if men versus women are promiscuous. Personally, I think that this is not something you could apply to the West overall. I think that generally speaking, rape and sexual assault are properly condemned in the West, but I do think there are subsets, there are pockets, religions, workplaces, whatever kind of subculture you can imagine. There are some online, as well as online, that do have this kind of rape culture, but I don't think it's a problem for most Western countries on an overall sort of view. Where the question gets political, I think that's a cultural, social question. Where it gets political is when we're talking about whether the perpetrators are brought to justice. And sometimes, of course, if a rapist is not brought to justice, this has to do with individual failures of, judge or police officer, whomever is involved. But what you see sometimes is arguments that actually this is a systematic problem, that the rules for evidence are such that it's almost impossible to get a conviction, or that systematically a bunch of cases are being dismissed without the evidence being properly examined or whatever. So there can be, depending on the specific jurisdiction we're talking about, there can be legal issues with the perpetrators being brought to justice and women being believed and things like that. Of course, that's a really complicated issue because you have to look at all the standards of evidence and the legal processes and things like that. But overall, I think it's fair to say that overwhelmingly there is still a huge problem with rape. In England and Wales, it's estimated that 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 kids, and 1 in 18 men reported rape, which is a massive percentage of women. And the kids aren't broken down into girls or boys, but women and girls. Of course, it is a problem for men and boys as well, but it's a much bigger problem for women. And those numbers, by the way, do not include sexual harassment. They don't include repeat offenses, and they don't include the massive number of unreported instances. So I think it's definitely fair to say that rape is a major issue, and you can break it into its political and sociocultural components. But and I think the cultural component is really going to depend on where you are, and there are a lot of different factors. But there's still an unacceptably high amount of rape, I think, even in the West. Second issue is domestic violence. Here again, I think there is a political and a social element, but let me discuss the stats for you. First, on a global level, 30% of women over 15 have been subject to violence by their partners. 38% of all murders of women are by their partners. And lest you think that this is just, cultures that don't value women as much, perhaps in Africa or Asia, looking at Europe specifically, over 2,000 women in Europe are killed per year by partners or ex-partners, and 90% of the victims of violent sexual crimes are women. So again, this is something that is already illegal, but it's still happening on such a wide scale. It makes you wonder, are there problems with enforcement? Are there problems with police not taking appropriate action? And I know I can speak for the US in saying that there have been a number of cases reported and discussed where women have been threatened by partners or ex-partners. They've reported it to the police haven't done anything, and then those partners or ex-partners have killed the women in question. So there is a question of police response and policy in regard to that, and that is a legal issue. But I think there's also a cultural question of nobody, I think on the surface, is okay with domestic violence, and yet it's still happening. So there's a disconnect here. Is it that people are not talking about it enough? Is it that people are there's some sort of acceptance of violence in certain circumstances that people aren't comfortable admitting. I'm not sure, but I do think that it wouldn't be happening so much if there wasn't some sort of premise that was common enough to be causing it to continue to happen, besides the legal deterrent. I promised those were the most difficult issues. Now onto somewhat lighter things. Another thing that modern feminists talk about is clothing, and I see a couple of different debates around this, or conversations. They're not always debates. This is sometimes a more friendly topic. Sometimes people will talk about whether it's more empowering for women to wear modest clothes or to wear revealing clothes, to cover up, collarbones to ankles, or to wear mini skirts and low-cut shirts. Like I said, in the West, very often this is completely a matter of choice from a legal perspective. And so it's more about what's socially acceptable and what are the restrictions within certain workplaces or religions or what have you. Personally, of course, I think people should be allowed to wear whatever it is that they choose to wear, as long as they're not literally indecent. But I don't buy the I am not religious, but I don't buy the religious explanations I've heard for arguing that women need to be modest. But if you're not forcing it on anyone, that's your choice, and we can disagree on that. Lucy DeLapp is a historian of feminism, and she talking about, again, historical feminism sort of up through the I think she was covering up through 2020. She wrote that women's bodies have been physically and symbolically injured and constrained by forms of dress designed to immobilize, to please men, and objectify women's sexual attributes, or to demonstrate women's purity and modesty. So we can see, I think, some of that is still happening today, again, in certain subsets or certain areas. The point about pleasing men, there's a discussion, I've seen a lot about online about whether women are dressing for the male gaze in order to please men, and whether that's a problem if they are. Some women say that you should never dress for the male gaze. Others say, well, if you want to dress to impress a man, so be it. That's your choice. And there's nothing wrong with that. So these are some of the conversations that are being had. To me, the most important thing is that people have choice and feel comfortable in what they're wearing. Another issue, and I'm not sure how much of a conversation this is in Israel, I have to say, but it is a big issue in Eastern Europe. It's a big issue in the US. It's a big issue in Latin America, and that's abortion and birth control access. In the EU, most countries have broad access. I'm not sure how well you can see the key there, so I'll explain the top graph or map to you. The color that most of the countries are, that sort of medium blue, is broad access. It's relatively easy to get an abortion until the last few months, and there's not too much in the way of legal restrictions. The teal is accessible, but with some restrictions. These are usually things like waiting times or mandatory counseling, that sort of thing. And then the dark blue is lots of restrictions. It's very difficult to get an abortion legally. I mentioned that this is a big debate in Eastern Europe, with many of those countries being a little bit more conservative and sometimes having more restrictions. So an example of feminist response to this in Ukraine in 2008, they proposed various measures to restrict legal access to abortion, and a group sort of sprouted up called Femin, and they were a feminist group. They very vociferously opposed these restrictions, and they carried on. I think they have since spread to other countries, but in any case, and typically the feminist position has been accessible abortion, and the only questions are things like, does the government fund it or not? And of course, as a libertarian, I'm against government funding of it, but easy legal access. In Israel, I looked it up, and apparently abortion has been legal in Israel since 1977, but there was a requirement for a termination board, which had a very high rate of acceptance, like 99.4% acceptance rate of allowing abortions to go ahead when a woman requested them. But the number of abortions that have been requested have been in decline recently, and many experts think that's because of increased access to birth control. The termination board is apparently either has been removed as a restriction or is going to be. Couldn't quite find clarity on that point. But apparently legally, relatively easy access. It would be interesting to me to know if there's a lot of social debate about it, whether like it's socially acceptable given the different religions and their views on it in Israel. The next issue, I'm going to preface by saying I do think this is an issue. I think it's very badly named. And the issue is what's often called the pink tax. And the reason I think it's badly named is because it's not a tax. And the government is not enforcing it. So badly named. But the pink tax basically describes items that are essentially the same, but are marketed at women versus marketed at men, costing more. So the graphic there gives some examples. Very often people are talking about toiletries and clothing, and just items that are generally similar. And this was a big issue in like the mid 2010s. So in 2015, there was a study in the US that found price differences ranging between 13 and 48% for items ranging from shirts to helmets to shampoo. And the UK in 2016, they found that women and girls were being charged on average 37% more for toys, cosmetics, and clothes. So my big question on this, of course, I don't believe the government should step in and force people to make their prices the same, but why? Why are you making razors that are pink cost more than razors that are blue? And literally, sometimes that's the only difference in the products. Why are manufacturers and retailers making those choices? And to some extent, you could ask why are consumers putting up with them, but actually we can see from the pressure in the 2010s that they're not always putting up with them. And sometimes you have a choice, but sometimes you don't. I often buy men's razors because they are cheaper. But if I were to make that decision with clothing, it would be a radically different decision. And probably not a very good one for me. So
Yeah,
it
I
is
mean,
their choice.
it's all about demand and supply. If there's a demand, women buy pink. There's not such thing, pink tax. There's a demand. So just don't buy pink stuff if they are more expensive.
Yeah, and I do have to say, like, the public pressure has to some extent worked on this. In the UK, there was a big campaign with Boots, the major pharmacy chain here, that was pointing out that, hey, like men's and women razors, they're the same thing. Why are you charging? It was like 50% more for the women's razors than the men's, and Boots declined to comment, but they changed the price. So public pressure and where you have a choice, I think consumer choice does play in. So the next issue is actually a tax, though. So this one is correctly named, and it's generally referred to as a tampon tax, but really it's a tax on all menstrual products. And this is just refers to the fact that many governments do tax menstrual products to a lesser or greater degree. The map in Europe here shows at the time, which was 2020, only Ireland didn't tax menstrual products. And other countries taxed it between 3% and over 20%. The map notes that at the time, Spain and Switzerland were planning to reduce their taxes, but they were still planning to keep the taxes there. In the UK, there was a huge uproar about this in the late 2010s because menstrual products were being taxed as luxury items, which obviously they aren't, they're basic necessities. But that tax was removed in 2021. So unfortunately recently, but we did win that one here in the UK. This one is really controversial. So I've been working on getting my head around it and understanding the data, but I'll present it as best I understand it. This is the gender pay gap. And essentially, because there has been for a long time and remains to this day some gap in most sectors in most countries between what men are paid and what women are paid. The World Economic Forum estimates it's between 11 and 38%, depending on the type of role, the industry, and the region. And I've seen two sort of knee-jerk responses to this and then a somewhat more nuanced response, and I'll share all of these. Generally, the leftist and to some degree the feminist response has been, oh, there's a disparity in outcome, therefore there must be discrimination. The conservatives and some of the libertarians have said, well, nobody is forcing them to do this, so this is just market forces at work. The more in-depth, nuanced response is, well, let's break it down. Let's look at what are the differences in experience and education and types of jobs that women versus men are in, and see if that makes a difference. And what they found when they did those kinds of more in-depth studies is that the gap is much, much smaller, but it does still exist. So with that remaining smaller amount of gap, for example, there was a study done in the 1980s that found that differences in experience and education and those kinds of things, type of job, accounted for about 3/4 of the gap. That remaining quarter is what we're talking about. So it's a much smaller issue than it sometimes looks at first. But that remaining bit, it's hard to explain. Is it just because women are choosing to go into jobs that don't pay as much or to work less because they want to take care of their families more? Is it because employers are discriminating or that they're making rational calculations based on women of childbearing age are more likely to go on maternity leave and that kind of thing? So I think there's still a little bit that's harder to explain, but this is something. And then there's still sorry, I think we've got And then there, of course, there's also, as there are with many of these things, the question of what do we do about it? And there are some who would advocate legally mandating that men and women be paid the same. And apparently there was a whole scheme in the 80s called comparative worth, which was supposed to calculate exactly what different professions should be paid. And obviously that's just price control or wage fixing by the government, which we know would be a disaster economically, and I think is deeply immoral for the government to force that on people. But the other question is there a social shift that needs to happen in terms of valuing the work of women? Of course, the leftists have the sort of Marxist view that just because that the like the inherent importance of the work is what's most important, as opposed to what Anna brought up before, supply and demand. And so we have to take that into account when we're talking about wages, which are essentially prices for labor. So a little bit complicated, but it's something that people talk about a lot. And I know some LOLA chapters have been involved in discussing voluntary solutions to the gender pay gap in their own countries, like LOLA Poland, for example. The next issue is one that I only learned about recently via social media, and I looked it up, and actually it bears out pretty well. And that's about health and health research. So the claim I've heard a lot on social media from feminists is that doctors are less likely to take women seriously and therefore more likely to gaslight them. And then as a result, women are not being diagnosed as often or as early. And of course, with some conditions that are progressive, if you aren't diagnosed early, then it's more difficult to treat. And quick look at the data. Obviously, you can't account for a doctor's behavior, but you can see that actually women are less likely to be diagnosed with certain conditions or more likely to be diagnosed later. The graphic on the left is looking at women's health conditions versus men's health conditions and how likely they are to be diagnosed. And you'll see that the men's health conditions are more likely to be diagnosed than the women's health conditions. And then there's the related issue of health research and whether or not women are included in clinical trials and studies on diseases and things like that. And apparently it wasn't until the 1980s that it was generally accepted in the US and much of Europe that diseases affect men and women differently, and medicines affect men and women differently. And if you're doing a clinical trial on a medicine, but that's going to be taken by men and women, but you aren't accounting for the efficacy, the safety, the side effects on men versus women, which can be quite different, then you aren't giving a true picture of that. The US responded to that with legislation through the National Institutes for Health, which was sort of a complicated issue, I think, because the National Institutes for Health fund a lot of research. So their policy, which was not instituted until 1993, that women need to be included in all clinical trials unless it's for something that's just for men's health. That was for things that the government is going to be funding. So they're not forcing it on private funding. Of course, I'd rather the government weren't funding health research, but there you go. I couldn't find any comparable policies for Europe, but it seems to around that same time, late 1980s, early 1990s, it started to be more of a discussion and a policy, whether explicit policy or general policy, that it wasn't until the same time, more or less, that started to be standard practice. And lastly, decriminalizing sex work. There are some groups that are explicitly dedicated to this, but this is an issue. I think it's less popular now than it was a decade or two ago, but it is still a conversation that people are having in feminist circles. And Norma Jean Almodovar gives us a couple of, I think, key arguments, or sums up the arguments for us. The main argument is that if you own your own body, then certainly you can choose to do what you will with it, of course, assuming we're talking about consenting adults. Many of the arguments against prostitution, legalizing prostitution, have to do with either just the general social good, which is, of course, you have to ask according to whom, and if you give the government the responsibility for enforcing that, then you're giving them all kinds of power you don't want them to have. But the other arguments are around protecting the prostitutes themselves, protecting their safety, protecting people from being forced into prostitution, children from being forced into prostitution, etc. These things would be illegal even if prostitution were legal, and so Almodovar says that laws against prostitution are extraneous and do not protect women from anything. And in fact, it actually makes it more dangerous for them because if they're a prostitute and they face abuse and they go to the police, well, now they can be arrested for being prostitutes, and the violence against them may or may not be taken seriously. So taking them out of the legal system actually increases the violence. And we see this in other fields as well. If you look at the drug war, for example, making drugs illegal increases the violence around the sale and the use of them. It's the same with prostitution. So whatever your moral view on prostitution is, feminists generally argue that it ought to be legalized. Not all of them, again, but I also want to talk about, so those are the big issues I see women talking about today in the data and sort of arguments I could find around them. I want to separate out a few sort of strains or ideas that we saw come up more recently. The first is in the 1970s, we saw two ideas start to come about, like late 1970s, early 1980s. The first is intersectionality. And this is a buzzword now. You hear it in regard to woke ideology, and you hear it in critical race theory. But it was people like Audre Lorde who made that really popular. And the idea is that you can't just look at sex or sexism. You have to look at sex and race and class and country of origin and put all of those things together to give a picture of a person's identity. As defined for identity politics, I don't think that's actually a full picture of identity, or even a very helpful one. But Lorde argued that racism, sexism, and homophobia are inseparable, and you can't look at one without looking at another. This was in the context of she was at a feminist conference, and she was upset that there weren't more Black and lesbian feminists there. The next is the argument that biological sex isn't real, and this has, you probably heard, come up again more recently in conversations. But I think Simone de Beauvoir probably laid the foundation for this argument, but people like Monique Wittig really fleshed it out and put it exactly as it is. Wittig argued that a materialist feminist approach to women's oppression destroys the idea that women are a natural group. And she went on to argue this at length, that actually there's no biological basis for sex and for separating men and women, and that we're just different political classes and not different kinds of biological organisms. I'm sure you've seen that idea crop up in some form or another. So in the 1990s, I think we got a few things that I would regard as not so great and a few things that I would regard as good or just neutral. In the 1990s, we started to see arguments tying together environmentalism and feminism. So Winona LaDuke at a UN conference argued that the oppression of women is similar to the exploitation of natural resources. I read her speech. I don't understand that argument. I think she was just arguing from the sort of oppressed, subjugated perspective, but they're not really the same since women are conscious beings and the environment isn't. You also started to see more and more the underlying premise that power is more important than truth. And again, I think you still see this in certain sects of feminism and in the left today. But to give an example from the 90s, at that time, there was a huge high-profile trial dealing with a man who's now a Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas. A former employee of his had accused him of sexual harassment, and Rebecca Walker, for example, this is just one example, she's representative, was arguing that it's not actually important whether he did or did not harass the woman in question. Her name was Anita. It's about how much power he had over her. And so you get the idea that power is more important than truth. And this is, again, pervasive in the sort of CRT type of circles. Affirmative action is not new to the 90s, but in the 90s, you started to see prominent feminists like Gro Harlem Brundtland support these policies in the context of women in politics or women in the workplace. Brundtland was the Prime Minister of Norway, and she was at the UN's fourth conference on women. She supported the idea of having affirmative action so that there would be more female candidates in politics, because it was mandated by the government. So government forced to make sure that women were being properly represented. In a more positive change, you started to see more of an inclusion of lesbians. As I mentioned toward the beginning, lesbians were often not welcome in feminist circles, feminist groups, feminist movements. In the 90s, that started to be less and less the case. It started to be more common. You started to see more prominent feminists advocating for the inclusion of lesbians. And finally, just because it wasn't a cultural force, I'll mention there was also riot girl punk music and magazines, and this was just a cultural expression of feminism at the time. You still see to some extent an sort of exploration of feminism in a different way than what people had already done. And punk music, of course, was around before the 90s, but the Riot Girl Manifesto came out in 91. That's why I've put it in with the 90s. But what about today? What does feminism look like today? Well, if you look up modern feminists, you get a lot of celebrities, weirdly enough. You get people like Emma Watson, Meghan Markle, Mindy Kaling, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, Laverne Cox, Jamila Jamil. And most of these women don't just call themselves feminists, they've been involved with some feminist activism or movement or idea to some extent, but it's not their main job. Their main job is something else. Most of these women, I think, are actresses. You also get a few politicians. People, probably the most high profile would be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whom you may know is a socialist, and not shy about that fact. You also get some really inspiring activists. For example, you have people like Malala Yousafzai, I can never say her last name, Malala, from Pakistan, who very courageously has defended the right of women to education. And you get a few of what I would sort of refer to as the old school feminists. People like Angela Davis, who's a radical feminist. She's a Marxist. She's very anti-Israel. She helped lead the women's marches in 2017 after the election of Donald Trump in the US. So this is a lot of what you see. I think also, though, there's mainstream feminism. Again, this is self-identified. This is where I think it gets even messier because it's just people sort of in the real world, out and about, chatting with each other and on the internet. We're not really talking about formal books or articles or debates or anything like that, but just people out in the world who call themselves feminists. And I think there are a couple of things I want to note in that regard. One is you have social media movements, things like the Me Too movement, which in my view are kind of mixed. On the one hand, it brought to light sexual harassment and abuse that was happening. On the other hand, it encouraged a sort of subjective view, which was not new, but in a different form, that evidence doesn't matter. It's about people's feelings. If somebody feels that it happened, then it happened. On the other hand, I think you have a lessening of the idea that I mentioned before, that if you wear makeup or you are feminine or you like popular culture, that you are part of the problem. Camelia Paglia described it this way, that popular culture is no longer the enemy. Fashion and beauty are of interest again, instead of being automatically labeled as oppressive tools of the patriarchy. So this is part of why I think mainstream feminism today does not look like the women's lib movements of the 1960s that Rand was so against. Either physically look like or sort of metaphorically speaking. Within mainstream feminism, I think we have libertarian feminism. And one of the distinguishing things I've seen, besides just not having a lot of this philosophic basis of radical feminism, is the differentiation between political and cultural issues. Libertarian feminists are very careful to distinguish between what is the government's job and what is not the government's job to fix. And of course, sometimes there's disagreement about this, but I think it's fundamental to being a libertarian feminist. There is some debate. I think you could reasonably sort of talk about whether being a libertarian feminist means that you're a libertarian who's particularly interested in feminist issues, or you're a feminist who wants to deal with feminist problems from in a libertarian manner. I think that just is a matter of priorities, personally. But we'll talk a little bit more about labels later on. An example is Wendy McElroy. She wrote a lot, and she wrote both books, and she wrote in sort of major libertarian publications like libertarianism.org in favor of individualist feminism and distinguishing it from radical feminism or gender feminism. She sort of summed up individualist feminism as being, quote, based upon the belief that all human beings have a right to the protection of their persons and property. And this is a statement that I think most libertarians would resonate with. There are also libertarian feminist groups. As Anna mentioned at the beginning, LOLA does not identify as a feminist group because not all of the women within LOLA consider themselves feminist. There are some who are really active about reclaiming the word, and there are some who are less concerned with that. But I include LOLA here, A, because it's on the Wikipedia page for libertarian feminism, B, because they host conversations like this one about feminism and its relationship to libertarianism, and just C, because there is that because they do discuss women's issues from a libertarian perspective. There's a group that I'm sure would not mind being included here, Feminists for Liberty. And their website states really well their position, so I'll just read it to you. Feminists for Liberty is anti-sexism and anti-statism, pro-markets and pro-choice in everything. We are classically liberal, anti-carceral, and sex positive. We share many of the concerns of mainstream feminists, but believe that the best means of creating change in society isn't based on coercion, criminalization, censorship, or bigger government. And just to give a quick concrete, so that this is a little bit easier to understand, I think, rather than just having those sort of abstractions. I know one of the leaders of Feminists for Liberty is personally against abortion, like on a moral level, but she doesn't think that the government should be involved, and actually that making abortion illegal does not reduce the overall number of abortions, which is what she's most interested in. So to go back to our questions from the beginning, is feminism man-hating? Not when you properly define it, not when you're looking at the equality of women and the better treatment of women, and the issues that I talked about from a rational individualist perspective. Is it unnecessary? I will leave you to answer that, but do consider the issues that I and stats that I presented. And just because there are issues doesn't mean the government needs to fix them. What does it look like today? We have to account for radical feminism, but I think the majority of people who call themselves feminists today are the celebrities and the people you see on the internet talking about this kind of thing. And then libertarian feminism is voluntarism and individualism as applied to feminist issues and women's issues. And I'll give you some reading recommendations towards the end if you want to get a little bit more into that. So should you call yourself a feminist? First, I want to discuss the relationship to individualism, because I have had a lot of people argue to me, and people whose opinions I really respect, and I think somebody even made this argument on the panel that Anna mentioned earlier, that we don't need feminism because we have individualism, because we have the idea that you should treat each person as an individual and judge him or her based on his or her merits, and we support equal rights for every individual, and there's no need to break it out by sex. To me, individualist feminism is a sort of subset of individualism, because it does support all of those things, but it also acknowledges that there's unequal treatment of women, and that's what we want to change. And when that is no longer the case, then I would say it's unnecessary. But if you prefer to rally behind individualism and individual rights, I respect that. I understand it. I also want to just reflect for a minute on how important is it that we have that label, because I think although labels can be really useful for condensing our views and sort of describing our views on a particular subject, I think also sometimes people get really caught up on labels, and labels tend to make people a little bit tribalist. If you say you're feminist and they're associating you with I don't know, blue hair, I don't want to offend anyone who has blue hair, they associate you with the radical feminist, because people get tribalist when you put labels on things. But some people really like labels. So if you are one of those people, you do you. Just be aware of potential misinterpretations or misunderstandings. Be aware that some people are going to associate you with radical feminists. And even though your definition of feminism might make a lot more sense, that doesn't mean that other people are going to think of that definition. They're going to think of whatever definition that they have.
I think it's a similar issue with libertarianism. I mean,
Yeah.
if we
Absolutely.
call ourselves libertarian, we should be aware of how people perceive this term.
Mhm.
Similar.
Definitely. And so that's why, like, personally, I don't call myself a feminist unless I'm in a situation where I can clarify what I mean by it. If I'm in a situation where I don't think I'm likely to be misunderstood, then I modify it. I say I'm a libertarian feminist or an individualist feminist. And that's something else you can do. If one of those terms resonates with you a little bit better, I think just clarifying sort of which strain of feminism you associate yourself with is a good idea. But at the end of the day, you should do what you're comfortable with. You should be aware of your context. I'm an objectivist, so I do not advocate for martyrdom. I don't think you have any duty to call yourself a feminist, even if you agree that all 9 of the issues I discussed are big issues. That doesn't mean you have to call yourself a feminist in my view. Do what you're comfortable with. Just bear in mind how people are gonna react to that. So just before I promised Anna I would answer questions, but if you want to read into any of this a bit more, some books there. The Essential Feminist Reader is an anthology of feminism going back to the 15th century, so you get a very broad overview. Feminism's a Global History is a more narrative sort of discussion that looks at different aspects of feminism. And then Liberty for Women was put together by Wendy McElroy, and she has a couple of essays in there, but it's libertarian or individualist feminist perspectives on issues that in the late 90s, early 2000s were thought to be very important modern issues. Some of them have been, some of them haven't been, but in any case, a little bit more modern than your 15th century pieces. Anyway, thanks so much for your attention. And Anna, I can take questions. I don't know if you want to start with questions or.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angel. That was amazing presentation, and it's definitely helpful to put, to clarify all the perspectives. So I just want to sum it up about the term modern feminism. It's not a particular ideology, but it's more about the topics we are engaged with. Like the old school feminism was about the right to vote, the right to get your self-education, and the right to drive and the right to work. Nowadays, we engage more in salary gap, in pay gaps, pink tax, abortion. That's the modern topics, but it's not necessarily say something about the way you define modern feminism, because modern feminism is plural. There are many perspectives, many streams. Some of them might look crazy. I mean, we will never agree between us about what's supposed to be feminism. And I mean, you had your some perspective that I didn't necessarily agree with, but the most important thing that you have constructive arguments. And unfortunately, I can say that a lot of people who have any argument against or for feminism. And so thank you so much for it. And I also want to give Nissan to talk. Nissan, your stage.
Hi, gonna start the video so you can see me. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, before
Hi.
that, I just want to say that Nissan is one of the chapter leaders in Israel. So,
Wonderful.
Oh, lighting in here is horrible. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much. This was an amazing sum up. You touched a lot of issues, which every single one of them can be like a whole lecture. But I'm gonna start off answering actually your question about abortions in Israel. So actually, Israel is extremely pro-choice, even though we are kind of a religious country. It does relate to Judaism because Judaism isn't all that. It's not like Catholicism. It's not that anti-abortion, but also it relates to other issues. Anyway, in Israel, you do have a committee that every single person that wants to get an abortion has to go through, but it's mostly a rubber stamp. Like if you're single, if you're over 40, if you're a minor, then you automatically get an abortion, every single woman. The problem starts if you're married and want an abortion and you're under 40, then they will really like it's very much a governmental intervention in the property of a woman. Like they want to make sure you have a valid reason, what's valid. It's not only your choice at this point. It's like, I mean, what's your relation with your husband? Is it his kid? Are you depressed? Are there any medical issues? Also, any medical issue at all will get you an abortion, even after 24 weeks. So that's how pro-choice and pro-healthy babies Israel is. If they're healthy, if they're unhealthy, if the mother is at risk, automatic abortion. But if you're a married woman who, for any reason, wants to get an abortion, practice your right of choice, then it gets a bit more tricky. It will still probably be approved, but not automatically. So, and another thing, all of the issues were so interesting, and as I said, there is a lot to say about all of them, but mainly I was surprised like modern parenthood wasn't one of them, because I think the most the issue that really is in the base of modern feminism, like after we have our financial independence, and once we have all of these other issues pretty much sorted out, is okay, but women are doing twice the labor because now they're also in the workforce outside the home, but still doing the majority of work inside the household. And as a suffragist propaganda from like a century ago, you can see that this was their actually worst fear of men being anti-suffragists. They absolutely they did not want to change diapers. Like all these posters, if you give women the right to vote, eventually you will be the one doing the household work. This was their greatest fear, and I'm glad to say it did come true in a good way. My children are interrupting. I'm glad to say, in my opinion, it's good. It did come true, but we really have to persevere, and we really have to get to a point where men are doing 50% of child rearing and of taking care of the household, and more in a sense of mental load. Like the actual distribution, it's more of an individual choice of each family, but in the sense of it is their problem too. It's not children are not only associated with I elaborate in the and thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you. That was very illuminating on the situation in Israel, but also I absolutely, oh, I think we've got a funny echo. But yeah, no, that definitely could have been an issue. I was just focusing on things that I guess are more formal feminism, but even that is a discussion. And in the anthology that I mentioned, The Essential Feminist Reader, there is an essay on housework and how that should be divided. But personally, I think at the end of the day, it's up to each family to decide, but they're definitely, I think, you could argue about the degree, but I think there's still this impression that being the super mom who does it all, who has a career and who has kids and who still cooks the most, not that she cooks all the time necessarily, but she still does a lot of the cooking, like that's the goal. And on the one hand, it's amazing people can do that. On the other hand, I don't do it. I don't have kids. On the other hand, it's an unrealistic expectation in some ways, and I think people are likely to be burnt out if they're not sharing. And there's also a sense of resentment that grows between partners if you're not honestly talking about it and dealing with it in an appropriate way. Hi. So there's that, and I think there's relatedly the decision not to have a kid, and
okay.
I live alone with my husband. My mom and my mother-in-law luckily are not very big on pressuring me, and I work with objectivists, so they're all very like you do what's best for your life. But I know that I'm relatively insulated in that way. There are a lot of people who are pressured to have kids who don't necessarily want to have kids, but they just do because it's what's expected of them. And there have been certain social commentaries recently around the idea that it's essentially a woman's job to have kids just because she can. And I think there are all kinds of situations in which you can, but that doesn't mean you should.
Absolutely.
And
is declining
yeah.
in the West and also in some Eastern countries even more, because when you don't have the choice to do it all, when they put it on your head, it's either independence or be a mom. For like in Japan, North Korea, then a lot of them choose, okay, so I won't be a mom because I want my freedom, which is a very, I think it relates to a libertarian issue. Like most people, men and women, they just want to be free. They just want to have their life.
Absolutely, yeah. No, 100%. So I think that is definitely a valid, it could have been issue number 10.
Thank you so much.
Okay, anyone else want to ask a question? Raise your hand. No. So I'm gonna ask my question. Wow, I had so many questions. I have to choose one. I think many perspectives somehow associated with the psychological state of particular person. For example, Manhattan. When I see someone talk about how men are the evil, no, you know what? I will give you a personal example. I have a friend who I know for 20 years, a friend, male. He says that we should kill all men because, yeah, he say that. And because men are root of all evil. And obviously it came from personal experience and it came after October 70. And he had a teenage daughter. So all of it together, this emotional state, psychological state, is not rational thinking. But to be honest, the irony when you're preaching about it is actually very, I don't know how to say it in gentle way, it's very toxic. A typical man. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? So it's not really feminist. It's just hate men.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think
Well,
it
this is,
actually reflects his emotional state. So I
yeah.
think women who say that men are root of all evil probably is coming from personal trauma.
Yeah.
Sometimes we hear something ridiculous. We need to maybe try to understand where it's coming from and not to look into the argument itself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Ayn Rand has a great essay called Racism, which I bring up even though it's not about feminism or sexism, it's about racism, as the name suggests. But what she explains in that essay is that most racists are racist because they get a sort of pretend self-esteem, a pseudo self-esteem from looking at themselves as superior without actually having to accomplish anything themselves. And I think that's part of it's a similar issue when you get to the misandry and you get to the sort of feeling like a victim that you get in some of these the man-hating circles, the idea that we should get rid of all men. I think that's part of the root of it. There are a lot of things. To some extent, when there's legitimate trauma, you can understand why people would be a little bit more wary. But the problem is jumping from one group or ideology to then, okay, it's everyone. It's one thing, of course, October 7th, the problem is Hamas and related ideologies. That's the problem. That's what you want to get rid of, not just men. In the US, an example is with school shootings. Most school shootings or mass shootings are done by men. And so some people have said, well, okay, so the problem is men. It's like, well, no. The problem is what what psychological state are these people being raised into? And I think there's this idea that men are inherently more aggressive, but I don't think we've accounted for how we've socialized men versus women. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of what their actual behavior is. So, yeah, psychological state, I think you're absolutely right. And I think this sort of fake self-esteem is a huge part of the problem, to sort of sum up my answer there.
Yeah, nah, I think I always can find myself a feminist to argue with because I will never agree with no one, especially the most controversial group on Facebook in Israel is the feminist group because a lot of radical opinion, very, very extreme opinion, very hard to conjust. And I always find myself fighting with others, but I am feminist. I don't supposed to fight with them. But it just proves that there are so many perspectives about feminism, and it's very, very important to align on the definition before we
Yeah.
continue to fighting. Let's let's put on the table my definition, your definition, and let's talk about the argument itself instead of swallow being swallowed into the definition of feminism because we will never get out. Very
Yeah, you have
important
to
to
agree on the
focus on the
fundamentals.
arguments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Y-
So, yeah.
For sure. And that's why sometimes I wonder if the label's all that helpful. Because it encapsulates so many people, and then you end up, accusing people of being bad feminists or not really feminists, and then people gatekeep, and it's like, uh, again, I mentioned I'm an objectivist, and I see this sometimes with objectivists of like they're so worried about who is or isn't an objectivist or whether you're really an objectivist. I don't want to gatekeep the term. I want to talk about the ideas and how they can
Yeah.
improve our lives in the world.
Yeah, by the
So,
way, I have the same difficulties with men when I want to, address some topic. For example, it's very, very hard for women in Israel to discuss on in economic or financial groups.
okay.
So if I have my opinion about my position in terms of investment, they try to explain to me, oh my God, I wish I would find a man who love me as men love to explain women about investment. And I found some, I just joked about how men love to explain. And it developed a full conversation. I wasn't even involved about how I hate men. Me, I hate men. No, I don't hate men. I actually hate men and women equally. I'm just kidding. But I think every woman who consider herself feminist heard it at least once that she is a man hater.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, and this is why we have to remember the misunderstanding, the misconceptions.
yeah, but
They're going to
the
happen no
point
matter what you
is,
say and how innocent you are.
yeah, the point is that every time I try to express my opinion, I have to think double. I have to build constructive with the evidence, and men can say every shit they want. And that's frustrating, but it's a problem that we should address. You might not agree
Mm,
with me, but that's what I feel. That a lot of women feel this way, and we should address it. And it's challenging because men, not all men, of course, but a lot of men are getting into defensive position
mm,
and they start to attack.
yeah.
Yeah, men hater. Yeah, witch.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I think that's one of those problems that it definitely exists in some subsets of the culture. Like I'm relatively lucky that it's very rare that I've encountered that personally, but I definitely, except for I get weird comments on the internet sometimes, like when I've posted videos, and I've not even been very like feminist in these videos, but it'll be things like talking about GMOs, and they'll be like, "Oh, and why should we listen to you?" Well, I've just given you a bunch of data, so that's why. Like, or they'll say like, "Oh, you can't tell us about being healthy because you're unhealthy." It's like, excuse, this is a reel on Instagram. What do you know about my health? So I think there's this tendency to be more invasive or more comfortable commenting on like personal things about women than there is about men, even when that's totally not the topic of conversation. So that's the only way I've experienced it personally. But yeah, to whatever extent that's happening, I definitely think it's something that we can talk about and we can
Yeah, and
strategize about, I guess.
also the Olympic Games.
Hmm.
I was exposed to the different kind of comments. I wasn't aware of that before, but now I'm more aware of the way people commented about Olympics. Instead of talking
Mm.
about the performance, they talk about their bodies and
Mm.
like not in good way. Like, and I don't talk only about men, also women and men is equally. Oh my
Yeah.
God, she's so fat. She's probably unhealthy. Oh my God, her body is not natural. Oh, she looked like a man. And, it, I think more women getting criticized about your body than men. And I
Yeah.
hope we will be able to change it. And the only way to change it is to discuss about it. And we should find a way how to discuss it with men or with the
Mm.
culture without blaming them because they
Yeah.
are getting into defensive mode and becoming a fight. That's a challenge. And I think
Mm.
we both have the responsibility to be attentive, to listen to other side argument, and the other side have the responsibility to be more tolerant and try to explain what we feel without attacking and blaming and
Yeah.
say, yeah, man a hater or stuff like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, that challenge. So I hope education and discussion like this will be helpful. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
I
thank
hope
you
so.
very much, Angel. And we will have a recording for all who miss it because it was super, super interesting and I'm already getting comments in our Israeli groups. That was amazing. Thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful.
And I'm happy I have the recording. So thank you again. Thank you again. And
Amazing.
thank you.
Oh, thank you so much,
Bye.
Anna, and other ladies for participating. Wonderful to chat with you.
Yeah,
Have a
thank you.
good
So
weekend.
bye bye everyone.